Hi, this is Nancy with On Point TV and Quilting with Nancy. We are continuing, getting really near the end of the Sunset Over Dublin quilt. We've done all of the blocks, or at least all the techniques in the blocks. There are more blocks in the book. The book is available on the website, www.onpoint-tv, so take a look there. It's available as a printed book or as an ebook. So even if you live in Timbuktu, you can always purchase the ebook without having to pay, about $50 to get it to you. So take a look at that. Working on the borders today. Now I have taken you through the entire border process a couple of times. One time on the learning to quilt, and then also when I did the great basics. So I'm not going to go into as much detail as I did on those for doing the borders. And when you look at the big quilt that you see now, that is done with just traditional borders. It just had a 2-inch inner border and then an 8-inch outer border. So that would be what I would call a traditional classic border. Well, when we were doing one of the blocks that had the chevrons, it was so cool. They looked so awesome. And I came up with this crazy idea that maybe I would teach you how to do a chevron border on the smaller quilt. So that's what we're going to work on today. So with the chevron border, I do want to show you that this is kind of what it's going to look like. I used a rainbow of all of the colors that I'd used in my blocks and just continued to lay them out so that it was a rainbow going around. And I particularly love doing this kind of a mock mitered border, if you will, the corner of it. So super simple. So I'll show you how to do that too. So before we can put on the chevron border, we first need to put a traditional border on. So this one I just cut 2 inches. I do want you to know that depending on the size of your quilt, depending on the size of your chevron border, you might have to change that size of that inside border. So there's no magic formula that I can give you for it either. You're just going to have to think it through. Be thinking, all right, if I add a 3-inch border to this, then how many chevrons do I have to put in to make it fit? So oftentimes, when I did this one, I really had planned on cutting a 1.5 inch. And I'd have been very sad if I had. So when I do a pieced border, so anytime you're going to do a pieced border, I will always put on the inner border at least a 1/2 inch bigger than I think maybe it needs to be, because I can always cut it down because you need it to fit the pieced border. Keep in mind, if you're planning on doing a pieced border, that does mean that you are a brave quilter, because sissy quilters just won't do a pieced border. They'll just do a classic traditional one because it's so much easier. So the first thing we need to do with this quilt, because of the construction of this quilt, having the sashings and the cornerstones, instead of having you cut a triangle for those cornerstones, I actually just had you put a square in it. So before we can put the border on, we need to know where the border is going to set. Now, in a traditional quilt, like the Learning to Quilt or the Great Basics, I would actually trim the edge of the border so that it was 1/4 of an inch past the intersection here. But with this one, I don't want to do that. I don't want to trim it because these squares, if you trim it, you're going to have a bias edge on the border. And that's just a bad idea in anybody's book. Okay. So instead of trimming it, I want you to draw the line. So I'm going to find the point where the cornerstone and the sashing come together and place my ruler so the 1/4 inch point of the ruler is on that point. Then come to the next setting square over here, or setting cornerstone, and do the same thing, and then use a pen that you can see. So I pulled out all of my pens. I've got my big chalk pens, my little chalk pens, my little black pen, my big black pen. Big black pen is the one that won this time. And with that, I'm able to draw that line. So when I put my border on, I will just put it onto that drawn line instead of a cut line. Now I will trim that off later after I get done sewing it, but that's just going to make it so that you won't have any possibility that those corners are going to actually stretch. So I would have measured this the 3 times like I do in the other quilts, so I know what size it needs to be, cut it, pin it to the both sides, and I've already done that because I had to get some work done on there, and then you're going to pin it. When you pin it, don't be afraid to overpin. There's just no such thing as too many pins when it comes to putting on a border. Do not ever, and I really emphasize this in the other quilts, don't ever just lay the strip down and start sewing until you get to the end of it. That is a surefire way to get a really, really waffly border. Instead, you want to ease it in, putting on the exact cut measurement that you need, and then lots and lots of pins. Now I'm going to go to the sewing machine and sew this with a scant 1/4 inch, and when I come back, I'll show you how we will trim this and press this to get it ready for our chevron borders. So you can see that I have this sewn on, and this is the part that extended past, and I just want to take and trim it. Now technically you could use your rotary cutter or just use a nice pair of scissors and trim that off all the way down. So even here where there's just a single little square, I'm not going to trim off that excess part. I'm just going to trim this guy off. And then I'm going to press this. So just always be sure, as always, to set the seam first and then flip. Whoops, quilt's starting to get away from me. Okay. And then flip it up. And the reason that we drew that the way that we did was so that our border would be right here. It would come right to those corners right where we want them. So now I'm going to take you through the steps of making the chevron border. Now that we have our normal inner border on, I want to take you through the steps of making a chevron border and making it a rainbow chevron border, because we had all these great colors. I just thought it turned out really cool. And the placement of the chevrons. So if you look at this, this is how I decided to piece it. With the chevron, or the black section, pointing down. This is the first quilt I've ever done that before. Never done it like that before. It's always been with the chevrons up. And when I was going to put the border on, the rainbow border on, I thought it looked cool. So that means you have options. Options are always a good thing. So you can put it on where the chevrons are to the outside. You can put it on so the chevrons are on the inside. And when I get this quilt done, we'll show you a full-size picture of it, so you'll kind of see the effect that this sort of gives. It's kind of, I don't know, prairie point looking, if you will. All right. So this is how we're going to do it. I do want to show you kind of the layout here. I took all of the colors that I had left over, and I cut some strips that were 2.5 inches wide by 4.5 inches long. So I have like the whole little rainbow of color that I used. So everything was there. Now I knew that I was not always going to have it exactly in that rainbow-ishness, but enough that it will fool the eye, so you'll all think that I did it that way. And then of the black, I cut some 2.5 inch squares. Okay. When I lay it down, this is the corner. I'm going to move this out of the way because I'm going to teach you how to do that in a bit, but we're going to work on those chevrons. So the idea, I don't know if you can see, but I have drawn myself some diagonal lines here. So after I laid them down, so I didn't get confused, because it's so easy for me to get confused, and maybe you too. Maybe you feel me. You understand where I'm coming from on that, okay? So after I laid down the color ways that I wanted, I took my pen, I can't even remember which one, and I actually just drew a line. This one was down, up, on all of these, so that I knew that I would be sewing them in the proper order. Then I'm going to take the black little squares and set them on here, and then go to my sewing machine, and I'm going to show you how we sewed these together. So I'm here at my sewing machine, and we're going to go to the sewing machine, and I want you to know that I did put the seam tape on, the seam tape. Let's get a really good close-up of it. So you see that it's got the red center line, and then the black on the two sides. Those are 1/4 inch lines. So it works perfect for this technique. So come on in. I am going to keep my needle into the middle. So putting it back into the middle, I had moved it over to put my border on. So my needle is in the very, very middle. Going to start with a leader. All right. And I've got my little chevrons here. So I'm going to take the top one, and because I drew those lines. So that was the diagonal I drew to remind me which way these needed to go. To create it so it goes up and down like that, you've got to do them in opposite directions. So I'm going to start sewing here at the point, sew all the way off here, and you see that this is pointing directly to the red. So this seam tape for this is just so perfect. All right, so that's one of them. Now I'm going to get the next one, and the next one will go in the opposite direction, which means it's facing this way. So one faces up, I guess, or to the right, the other faces to the left, and you can always double check. Oh, there's my diagonal line. That means I'm doing it right. Better safe than sorry, right? It goes right along with that measure twice, sew once, cut once, that idea. So I'm going to go back and forth with this, having one face to the right, one face to the left. Now, if you do not have this tape, then all you need to do is actually draw a line right down the middle. So I have found that the tape has made things just go a lot quicker. So let me finish these up, and then I'll show you how we'll do the pressing. So I have all those chevrons, and I like when I put them down on my ironing board, silly things that make me happy. I just like seeing where it like went to the right and the left and the right and the left. And if you did it all correctly, yours should sort of look like this. Now you're going to take and cut them apart, but keep them in line because we're doing this rainbow look. Now, if you were doing all scrappy, you wouldn't have to do this, but I did one side at a time so that I was sure that I was not messing up my colors. And when you go to press it, I like to press it first, then fold this up, and then trim this off. Now with this, because they're going right next to each other, I want this one to be pressed up. So that is pressed toward the black. The next one that it's going to go next to needs to be in the opposite direction, because if both seams are pressing up, you'll have a very bulky seam right there. So take this and flip it under. So now the red and the black are under. Press that. And then trim off here. There's those little wasted triangles that I talked to you about. So I'm going to do that with all of them, but it's so important that every other one go up and down. So this press toward the black, this press toward the red. That means my next one needs to press toward the black so that these will be able to fit perfectly together when we sew them. So I have them pressed in opposite directions. So this one is pressed up, this one is pressed down, up, down, up, down. And it's just as simple as putting them together, and then those seams will butt right together. And because I'm going to start sewing right here, I'm not going to put a pin in it. When the bump or the place that might shift is at the very, very beginning, I don't usually put a pin in there. I'll only do it if it's in the middle. So I'm going to sew this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to use the line from the seam guide instead of actually moving my needle over. So for those of you that have said, you know, I can't move my needle over, I think that picking up some of this seam tape might be the answer to that. So here I'm going to do another one because I want to show you how I'll put them together on the next seam. Alright. Pick up on my leader. Grab a pair of scissors. Oops. There. Now putting them back in order. All right. Now I'm going to sew that middle seam here, and again, they will just butt right together. But this is in the middle of this entire strip, so I will put a pin there. I want to be sure that that stays where I wanted it to. So I'll line up the top and continue sewing this, coming to the pin, always sewing over my pin, just at a very slow speed. And then come to the leader. So I'm going to finish this portion of the border, and then we'll show you how we're going to put it on. So now I put the chevrons all together so you can see my kind of little rainbow of color. keep in mind they're not always the same. Please never look at my quilt close enough to go, Nancy, you should have had that red next to that pink instead of, yeah, just don't do it. Looks pretty to me. That's all that matters, right? So I've got my border ready, and now it's time to do the little corners. So these little corners are so fun, and they're so easy. And I did talk to you about how to do these when we did the rail fence quilt. And when we did the rail fence quilt, we did a piano key border, and then I did this kind of mitered border on it there. So this is what I'm going to do. Coming to the other side. These are going to be my colors. So I'm going to go back to the green and the blue. Yeah, I know they duplicate. Just don't tell anybody, okay? And then this will be the purple that will connect up with the edge here. So the idea is I'm going to go and just sew these two together, and then I'll show you what's next. So I've got my little corner designed here, and the idea is that I'm going to go the blue, green, green, blue, and then green, blue, and that's okay. And then this one will go from the reds to the purples. So when I pieced this, I actually pressed this one toward the green and this one toward the light purple. So now they will butt together. And then I will sew a diagonal line. So I'm going to sew the diagonal on the actual diagonal of a line so that it will look like this. When I get that done, I'll come back and then I'll show you how we will measure the quilt to make sure that the chevron border is the right length. Have my chevron border all pieced, although I realize now I need to turn it around. Okay, there, that makes it look better. Whenever you do a pieced border, the next step is so important. You need to do the measuring like we've always done, and then you might need to make some adjustments to the border. Now, if it's an inch adjustment, then you might need to add a coping strip to one end or the other. But with something like this, the easier thing to do is to adjust the seams within the piece border. So I measured the quilt, and it came out to, I'm thinking it came out to 54 inches. And then I measured the piece border, and it came out to 54¼ inches. So that means I just went back into one of the seams, and I'm trying to see if I can, so right here, and I don't know if you can tell, but I just, on these two seams, I just went back and just took a little bit more of a seam. So between that, and that was maybe a 1/16 of an inch, and this was 1/16 of an inch, those all added together, magic of math, and I had my 1/4 of an inch. So now when I measured it, it actually fits perfectly. So I'm gonna sew this on, and then the top of the quilt will be done. When we get together next time, me and some friends are going to baste the quilt. So I want to show you the basics of basting. We're going to baste it, and then our last episode will be the quilting of the quilt. So remember, the book is available on the website, onpoint-tv. I hope that you've already subscribed to the channel so you're not missing any of the episodes. And if you'll hit that notifications bell, then you'll be sure to always get a notification when we air a new video or if we go live. I do have a membership you could consider joining. So this quilt in particular was designed on the program Electric Quilt, and I have a membership. So there's a $5 membership that's pretty much just helping me do what I do. The $10 membership is for EQ training. So you actually get to join me once a month with the other members of the group, and we get together on Zoom, and I actually do some EQ training, so teaching you how to use that program to design your own quilts. And then there is the Quilt Addict level. With the Quilt Addict level, you get to learn how to do the designing, and once a month I send you one of my books, one of the e-versions of the book. So there's a lot to look at. So if you have any questions about it, you can always send me an email for any questions at all. quiltingwithnancy@gmail.com. And I will see you next time when we're doing the basting of the quilt.